Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Aaron Bolerjack. I'm one of the pastors at OKC First Church of the Nazarene, and I will be moderating this panel, and by that I mean mostly trying to stay out of the way. We have before us maybe the best panel I've seen for these kinds of conversations. I'm really anxious to get going and grateful to our esteemed panelists for lending their education and experience and expertise to this sometimes difficult, always important conversation about human sexuality and about the ways that faith and science shape the ways that we think about it. In the interest of time, you have biographical information in front of you already in the programs, and we're not going to spend an awful lot of time there, but I will ask each of the panelists, we'll start with Dr. Reiner and make our way back this direction toward me. The same few questions to kind of set the stage and prime the pump for our time of general questions later. So we'll start with some specifics that will be posed to each of the panelists, and then we'll see where the conversation takes us. So, starting with Dr. Reiner and working toward Dr. Boone, what is your personal faith and science background? What kind of traditions were you handed as a child? What were you taught about those things? And how have you responded to that?
I guess I was not an atypical child of the late 40s and 50s. My family had a very strong religious background. My grandparents were Presbyterian missionaries in Korea. My father was born and raised there, but after the war, they didn't quite know what to do, I think, especially my father, with his faith. So it sort of petered out. But I think that richness filtered through in some ways. And as I became older and learned more and more of our family background and of my own, learned more and more of my own brain, so to speak, I think that the faith became more and more important, and I am Presbyterian at the present time. It has been Presbyterian Church has been accused of being a place where you get good business contacts, but I'm not in business, so it doesn't really matter. In terms of the science, I'm not sure I would really call myself a scientist, but I've gotten very involved in the science because of the kind of topics that we're going to cover tonight. And I've really been brought there, taken there by my patients. I am a physician, a little bit ridiculously overtrained, but that all happened because of patients that I dealt with, mostly children, because that's what I had primarily seen. So it's a science background that comes in through the questions that the children or their parents asked me that I couldn't answer, and a faith background that I think is really in many ways innate, not the Presbyterian part, but the faith and spirituality part.
Excellent, thank you so much. Dr. Pitt, what about you? What kinds of faith and science traditions were you handed as a child, and how have you responded to those things?
Well, I was raised here in Oklahoma, and my parents were practiced from the Baptist religion, so I was brought up in the Baptist church, and actually went to Oklahoma Baptist University for a while when I first started school, which was at the age of 16, and then moved on and away from Oklahoma and to Kansas City and then to Dallas. And in my journey, as far as my faith went, moved away from the Baptist religion and into the International Churches of Christ for quite a long time, and was there. And it's fairly strict kind of structure religiously. Faith-wise, after being in that religion for about 10 years, I moved on, and I'm currently now in a non-denominational congregation. I have a strong faith about what it means to be a Christian, and have kind of come to learn to bring faith and science together because of my training and profession. I'm trained as a psychologist, and also am probably way overtrained in terms of just education. For science, for me, it's important, and it has really informed my practice and my work. I work primarily with children and adolescents. That has been my entire training and career for for the most part. And science comes to me in way of my work that I'm doing now, too, with trying to study and better understand the struggles that adolescents face every day.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Justine?
My parents were both Southern Baptists growing up, but they did not take our family to church, maybe a few times. I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is a very spiritual area. Really, whether you're a Christian or not Christian, it seems like the majority of people that I knew growing up in Tulsa were very spiritual people. And I explored different faiths before becoming a Christian as a teenager, joining the Church of the Nazarene, including Wicca. It seemed interesting to me. It seemed more like when I became a Christian, it almost seemed like it rejected some scientific tenets that other faiths were embracing at the time. I remember having a youth pastor who used phrases like tree huggers and that the world is here, it's full of resources for us to use, and God put them there for us. And it seemed almost counterintuitive to me, but I did embrace Christianity very hard. It was a family, it was something I could belong to, and I don't regret that whatsoever. It was maybe a more conservative church in a lot of ways, and I became very conservative at that time, and I feel like my time studying theology at SNU opened me back up to some of the things that I felt were true really before I became a more conservative Christian in high school. So I currently go to a United Methodist congregation in Kansas City, Missouri. It is an open and affirming congregation, and it is part of the Reconciling Ministries Network. And while it's not a Nazarene church, it is Wesleyan, and I do feel very at home there.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Justin, tell us a little bit about your personal faith background and how that interacted with science.
Yeah. So, I grew up also Southern Baptist and very passionately evangelical. My nickname in high school was God Boy.
It's either the best superhero name ever or the worst. I'm not sure. But it's distinctive.
Probably the worst. I was the kid who always had a Bible in his backpack and a bunch of tracts and was ready to witness to anybody whether they wanted it or not.
Which is the best way to do it.
Yeah, some of you knew that kid in high school. On behalf of all of us God boys and girls out there, I deeply apologize. Some of you were that kid in high school, so hey. My faith has always informed everything about my life. I've spent the last 20 years of my life doing ministry work. I don't know who or what I would be without my faith. And so for me, faith is not just sort of one of many labels that I have. My Christianity is, it's so interwoven into the fabric of every part of my life that I wouldn't know how to separate myself from it. And I've always been interested in science. I was a psychology major. I was the kid who liked to read psych journal articles in my spare time for fun. So some of you knew that kid too, sorry. So I come to this conversation with a lot of just interest in how it all fits together from both of those standpoints.
Great, thank you. Dr. Boone, tell us a little bit about your faith background that you were raised in and how that interacted with science and what you've done kind of in response to that.
I grew up in southern Mississippi in the Church of the Nazarene. I was in church, I think, the second week of my life and pretty much ever since then. Mom and dad, deeply loving. Dad never graduated from the 8th grade, but one of the wisest men that I've ever known. So a deeply loving family. But in the pit of racism in Mississippi during that particular time, I remember getting on my bicycle and going over the overhead bridge to go downtown and watch Martin Luther King march during that time. Macomb was known as the bombing capital of the state of Mississippi at that time. So it was, I grew up in a religious context that was crazy in a lot of ways, because I watched people who used the N-word in casual conversation all week long, hardly ever a day of my childhood that I didn't hear that. And at the same time, these were people who would fast 7 or 8 meals a week to save money to put in the offering plate to send missionaries to Africa. So it was, I grew up in a faith that was that conflicted. I think I grew up, I never had a pastor in my youth that was a seminary-trained pastor, so a lot of fundamentalism was at the core of what I heard. It was going to Trevecca Nazarene University that really was the salvation of my life in terms of understanding both theology and the world that we're living in. And my eyes began to be open. I think I learned from my Wesleyan faith that you don't have to solve everything propositionally, that there are things you can leave open, which has intrigued my interest in science all across the years. There are all kind of issues that I have that aren't resolved because I'm not sure that scientifically we know all the answers to this, such that you kind of plant a flag in the ground and say, this is how it is and it can be no other way. So I think my faith actually has taught me to live with some dissonance in it and some questions that just continue to go on year after year. A few of them get solved along the way. In the process of serving the Church of the Nazarene and helping to write its new statement on human sexuality, I had to go do reading again, and so I dove into a lot of the scientific work, philosophical work, and psychological work on human sexuality, and I know just enough to be dangerous. I would embarrass myself in front of some of these people on this panel tonight, but it was an interesting thing to me to be reminded again of the complexity of our world and the makeup of human beings.
Great, thank you very much. We'll stay here with Dr. Boone and then kind of work our way back down. What is your particular area of expertise in this conversation? For some folks, that may be education. For some folks, that may be experience. For some folks, that may be something else. Dr. Boone, you're a pastor and a theologian and an administrator, college president a couple of times now. What do you feel like you bring to this conversation from your experience in education?
Yeah. I'll give you my wife's answer, what my experience is. She says, you're a fool. The whole idea that someone who leads a denominational institution would choose to be engaged in pretty significant ways in conversations about something as divisive as human sexuality, she says, you're a fool to even go where you've gone and try to do what you do. But from a pastoral standpoint and then writing, 25 years of my life before becoming a university president, I was the pastor of a campus church. So the kind of conversations that were happening behind the scenes, underground, they showed up in my office a lot. Apparently, I preached in a way that a college generation believed this is a guy you can go and talk to about anything. And so as a result, I pastored churches that were, in a sense, clandestine centers for getting help on human sexuality issues that they really hoped the dean of students at the colleges didn't find out about. So I found myself in that kind of life for 25 years, then getting to college and being in the middle of faculty who have all kinds of opinions about things, and sitting at cafeteria tables and talking with them, and then students that are interjected into all of those conversations. I think probably the best expertise I bring is that I serve a church whose constituency that supports a college is quite old and conservative, and I serve a generation of college students who think quite differently. And I'm forced to somehow find a way that these two can sit at the same table together. So that's sort of the expertise I think I bring.
Thank you. Justin, talk to us about your expertise, your perspective on this conversation. Is that shaped by education, experience, all of the above?
Yeah, I could write a book on my experiences with this conversation, and I did.
He did. It's really good. I read
thank
it
you.
on the plane coming over here. It's really good.
I'm glad to get that endorsement before any disagreements that may happen. So, long story short, I believed that the question of sexuality, specifically with regard to homosexuality, was very clear-cut from a Christian perspective. And I preached about it at my friends quite often. And
This is in your God Boy costume?
in my God Boy costume. I had been taught that being gay was a choice and that it was a sinful choice and that the Bible was clear about this, not to mention that, same-sex sexual behavior and same-sex marriage and so forth were not permissible from a Christian standpoint. And I didn't think that I was being in any way unloving by expressing those views. In fact, I wanted to be as loving as possible, but I also believed as a Christian I needed to speak the truth as I understood it from God's Word. I thought that I was doing it really well. I got accused of being a homophobe, but I was like, well, they just don't understand what it really means to be a Christian who believes the Bible. And then I discovered over a period of time how much I didn't know. From the moment that I hit puberty, I was never attracted to girls. I was only attracted to guys. But for years, I convinced myself that this was something that would change, that I would grow out of it, and I just tried not to think about it. And eventually, I had to acknowledge that I was gay, which turned my whole world upside down. I didn't want to believe that I could be gay. And so then I thought that I saw gay as a diagnosis for a disease. And I thought, now that I have a name for this thing, I just have to find the cure. And I went to what were then called ex-gay ministries, thinking I could become straight. And that didn't work. And many of the people who were held up as the success stories at that time now will tell you that it wasn't true. And so I thought, well, what does this mean as a Christian if I've always been taught this is a choice? I didn't choose it. I've done everything I know to do, prayed every prayer, trusted Christ for so many years to not be gay, and I still am. So now what? Is God calling me to lifelong celibacy? If so, what does that look like? Is there some room for me to have some kind of romantic but non-sexual relationship? Was my church wrong about the sex part? How do I understand what the Bible has to say? And as I read those passages that many of us have read over and over, I thought, a passage about in Sodom people gang raping angels doesn't seem to apply very much to my life. And
Thanks be to God.
Yeah. And so I found that as I went to the Christian leaders I trusted on so many other issues, many of them didn't know how to advise me other than to just say, don't be gay, don't feel this way, and would point to success stories who had already privately told me that they were still just as attracted to the same sex as I was. And I wrote my story online and met hundreds and then thousands of other Christians in the same boat who were really struggling in their churches and felt misunderstood, not just gay folks, but bisexual, transgender, and other folks along the LGBT plus spectrum, and started a nonprofit organization to provide support, and I've done that for 16 years, and this summer I parted ways with the organization I was running then, and I'm running a different organization, but this has been kind of my life's work.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Justine, I know you have in some ways similar, in some ways different kind of story. Talk to us a little bit about what education, life experiences, whatever you want to share. What do you bring uniquely to this conversation?
I feel like I owe you guys a bit of a disclaimer. I'm not an expert on really anything but being Justine Underwood Jones. I can tell you all about that. I'm probably the coolest Justine Underwood Jones you'll ever meet.
Strongly agree.
I also feel a need. I think that there's a tendency in academic conversations or conversations with your friends and in your life, sexual minorities or ethnic minorities, racial minorities, national minorities, often individuals are called upon to speak on behalf of their entire people group or their entire minority. and I cannot speak on behalf of every intersex person that you will meet. I am not the king or queen of the hermaphrodites. I am just me. Conditions are very different, and they vary from individual to individual. In my situation, I did not openly discuss my condition with family or with friends or classmates growing up, and that silence persisted all the way through my college experience. And I felt like that silence was killing me. I also felt called to be celibate, and when I did come out of the closet, it was met with somewhat mixed results from the church. While I still retained a lot of friends, family, everyone, a lot of people still loved me and accepted me for who I was. My future in ministry was a little bit awkward. I was asked to describe my genitalia to my church board. They did not return the favor, I'm sorry to say.
Thanks be to God. I move to dismiss.
So I did spend the first 25 some odd years of my life living as a male. Not all, in fact, probably not the majority of intersex people are also transgender. In my case, I did not feel comfortable in the sex of rearing, the sex that I was raised in. So I did transition and become female. I went from Justine to Justine, so I'll try not to answer your questions, but it's kind of still there. It's an impulse. But I was actually allowed to transition in the Nazarene church that I was serving in at the time, and I chose very specifically to transition there. I felt like the church could grow with me and support me through this, and there were individuals in my congregation who did so. At the same time, there was a lot going on in our nation at that time with people refusing to eat at Chick-fil-A and people saying, I'm only going to eat at Chick-fil-A because of the debate over same-sex marriage and the support of ex-gay ministries and all of these different things where that issue became very polarizing. And for me, silence about my situation and the way that it was treated in my church, the way that I was not asked to preach when other seminarians were asked to preach. I wasn't given interviews. I was at one point asked not to work with children because a mother was really uncomfortable with me teaching her children's Sunday school classroom. Things like that were very hurtful for me. The weird out-of-the-way ways that I was allowed to minister, and I continued to be silent, but I felt like that silence was killing me, and I felt the need to speak up for gay rights, knowing that this was an issue that the church had taken a hardline stance on, and breaking that silence did end my career in ministry in the Church of the Nazarene. I'm happy to be here tonight, and I'm happy to be invited back to speak here with several of you who are Nazarenes, but I am only an expert in those experiences and where my journey has taken me. I felt very informed by my situation that God celebrates diversity, and that diversity can take a number of different forms, in the form of an intersex person or a trans person or a gay person. And I felt like I was given a pass because I showed up with a doctor's note, and so I got to transition in the Church of the Nazarene, but I didn't feel comfortable being in a church and continuing in a career in ministry in a church where I didn't feel like I could invite a trans person or a gay person and know that they would be allowed to not only come and worship, but also accept leadership positions in the church and be someone that we might even dare to look up to.
Thank you for sharing. Appreciate it. Dr. Pitt, you have described yourself as overtrained and overqualified, and I've read your bio, and that was 20 minutes of my life I'll never get back, but it was informative. Tell us a little bit about where you come from when it comes to these kinds of conversations, and how that education and your experience and practice has shaped the way that you think about human sexuality.
Sure. I think, first of all, I get very uncomfortable with the word expert because I don't really feel like that's necessarily the case in any case. I feel like my expertise is really probably in knowing what I don't know. And that's has probably come from so much education and continually learning new information every day. I am formally trained, yes, as a psychologist and have an undergraduate degree in psychology, a master's in counseling, a doctoral degree in school psychology, another degree in behavior analysis, and on and on and on. So yes, I have had lots of training for sure. And I've always worked with children and adolescents. It was my goal when I started school to always work with children and their families, and have been fortunate to have the career to be able to do so in a number of capacities. As far as human sexuality, along the way in my training, I also taught, and I've taught undergraduate and graduate students for years and years, and now I teach at the College of Medicine, training physicians and residents. So teaching has been a big part of my career, and just trying to help others kind of come to understand too all of the issues in psychology, or just give them a kind of a glimpse into it. And part of my teaching was human sexuality, and I've taught that for a number of years. And now I have really the fortunate situation of being able to work with physicians and residents and train them in an adolescent medicine clinic. So we treat kids that are 10 to 25. So they are in the throes of sexual development and gender identity development. And it's a really fantastic place to be because I get to work with them every day as they're going through that journey and take that journey with them. And so, in terms of my understanding and my knowledge, I've learned some things educationally and through my experience of working with people who are going through the identity things that they're going through, and every day I'm learning. So I think that's where I am as far as, expertise goes.
Well, you are the most expert non-expert I think I've ever met. But thank you so much. Dr. Reiner, what role do your education and life experiences play in shaping the way that you think about human sexuality? I know in your case, one particular kind of practice led you to focus somewhere related but slightly different. Talk us through that journey a little bit.
Well, pardon me. Let me just begin by saying that I'm retired, so you really don't have to call me Dr. Reiner. My kids used to call me General Reiner, which is probably more apropos, but Bill is fine, really. In terms of the life experiences, I realize I've led a really pretty dull life when I'm listening to the other four panelists. My goodness. The stories are really, I think, rather riveting. And I think my problem really, let me just say it this way. Bill Cosby once made a comment that I found very amusing at the time. He said, I started off as a child. And I found it amusing because I realized I'd started off as an adult. And I went through my education, I went through my training, and I grew up with the same kinds of education that I think everyone here has spoken about, even the Mississippi part. Although I'm not from Mississippi, my wife is, so I have that secondhand. But in the process, much of what was said, I think the one that stood out the most was probably that people were homosexual because it was a lifestyle. And I have to say, talk about not being an expert, I still don't know what that word means, lifestyle. I am still working on that, and the people who tried to explain it to me, including experts, by the way, I don't understand. But what was clear to me was that when I listened to adults, or when in my medical world, my surgical world, I listened to adults, I started off as a urologist, and mostly pediatric urology. And I went into pediatrics because two reasons, really. I realized that you're really not treating the child so much. You may be operating on the child, but you're really treating the mother. And mothers are the most untrusting, anxious people that you can possibly imagine. And if you're not a mother or haven't been one, you probably don't really understand that comment. But I found that very challenging and very interesting, and really, in a way, very gratifying. And I found that I could work with mothers. It is difficult, but I found that I could work with mothers. what I also learned was that adults, when I talked to them about the human sexuality part of taking a history, for example, as a urologist, I found that the adults would give me all kinds of answers to questions, and sometimes it was quite clear that the answers didn't mean anything, and sometimes I was suspecting that I was suspicious of the fact that the answers may have been to try to steer me into another direction. In other words, I never was quite sure, that's not really fair, but often I was not quite sure that I could fully trust adults in terms of discussing human sexuality, especially their own. But what I found with children, which was rather unique, was that, the problem most people have with children is that they ask children questions. And who's asking the questions? An adult. And adults and children don't think the same way. So when you ask a child a question, most of the time, if they're a young child, they don't even comprehend. And I realized that fairly early on. And you get a yes or no answer, by the way, which is sort of like asking the adults a question. You get two different answers, but you're not really sure what they mean. You certainly don't know what a yes or no answer means from a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old or a 12-year-old. But I began to realize that if I made observations about the child to the child, they would invariably respond. Either by saying, well, yes, that's right, but more commonly they would say, no, I'm not mad, or I'm not this, or I'm not. And then they would, if you give them time, they would spontaneously give you some insight into what was going on in their head. And God knows I didn't have a clue. So I kind of chuckle at the word expert also, because I have seen in the field of dealing with kids with intersex and with major genital anomalies, I think if you add those two together, I've probably seen more kids and adolescents than anyone in the world, not because, well, because I've talked to them on the phone. They come to me from faraway places and close places, and I've learned everything I know either from them or from their mothers. Okay, I've learned some things from fathers, let's be fair, but mostly you learn from the mothers, and the largest amount I've learned is from the kids themselves, because kids can be very spontaneous if you set it up in such a way that almost no parents ever do, to allow the spontaneity. So I've learned what I've learned about human sexuality from children, from preteens, from adolescents. And as you realize, adolescence kind of carries on, especially when kids have problems with their sexuality or their genitalia or something like that. Adolescence kind of carries on into their mid-20s or longer. So I've continued to see, those are the adults that I see. It's the adults I've known as children. And that's where I've learned everything I know. So if I'm not going to tell you anything from an expert standpoint, because I don't really know what an expert is, except it seems to me it probably means that there aren't really any answers to the questions you're asking, and I'm going to give my opinion, and we're going to call it an answer. But I can provide what I've learned from following up on hundreds and hundreds of children with major developmental issues, anatomical, or in some case in terms of their sexual development. So psychosexual development of kids is really what I know, and I know it all from learning from them.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We'll stay, Dr. Reiner, with you and then sort of come back this way. And the last question I'd like to pose to each of the panelists before we take our break to stretch your legs, use the restroom, get something to drink, and keep it out of the auditorium. The last question I'd like to ask is, why is it important to understand human sexuality from your perspective, from your education, your experience? Why is it important to understand human sexuality in terms of both science and faith? Why do both of those perspectives matter when we talk about this particular issue?
That's a tough question, and I think I would answer it this way. I think that in order to understand human sexuality, well, let me put it from a more personal standpoint. A lot of what I learned, certainly from a faith standpoint, but also from a science standpoint about human sexuality, was wrong, both sides, and much of it continues to be wrong. So I think that when you begin to realize that the people of faith and the people of science are sometimes talking through their hats, then you realize that there has to be a reckoning within each of those two fields, if you will, and then some kind of understanding between them. my mother in particular was a very dynamic, incredibly opinionated, and usually wrong influence on my life, so that I had someone that I could react against almost my entire life. So I started rebellion. That's why I say I didn't start off as a child. I started off as a late adolescent because I was rebelling when I was probably 2 years old. And that
We'll be getting your mother on the next panel, if at all possible.
That would be fascinating. But what I would say is that I came to accept science and reject faith partly because of my reaction to my mother and the way I was raised, even though she was not a person of faith. But as I went through my education, my higher education, I began to see that there was no way to reject faith, and there was no way to live without having faith and science, at least reason in some sense. Sometimes science is reason and sometimes it isn't. But I think you have to have both in your life if you're going to be able to deal with the very questions of human sexuality and your friends, your family, your children. That's where you really start dealing with it. So I don't see how to separate them. I think that they're intertwined. It is two different windows, as it was an interesting comment from Freeman, by the way, but I hadn't heard that before. But that is kind of how I've looked at them, and yet I can feel like I can look out or look through both of the windows at the same time.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Dr. Pitt, same question to you. What is it about this important, complicated, difficult topic of human sexuality that calls for us to use the lens of both science and faith?
God, I think it's such a great question, and it is really the basis of why we're here. And science is, it's fascinating the comment that you made about science not always being right, because as I was preparing to come to this panel discussion, I was looking back through some of my textbooks on human sexuality that I used to use as a teaching mechanism. And it was so funny as I was reading through them, because I was like, oh, this is wrong, and this is wrong, and wow, that's wrong too. Because we've come along a path in science to where we are looking at things differently and exploring things differently. And so looking back at science, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it changes over time. And I think it's important that these two things come together in this way, because they are part of the condition of being human. I mean, we start dealing with sexuality, it starts from the time of conception, and then moving forward, throughout the lifespan. And so I don't see how we cannot talk about these things, yet we don't honestly talk about sexuality or sexual development, or these things have been taboo, and they still remain taboo. And it's time to have these discussions where people can have some talks around what it means to be a sexual human being, because we are. And and scientifically, we're learning every day. I think both, as was said before, I think both kind of fields have had their positions and their stakes, and neither are really right necessarily, and this coming together helps us help people, and I think that's what's most important, science or faith.
Excellent, thank you. Justine, what do you think? What is it about human sexuality that calls us to think through and look through the lens of faith, but also that of science?
I think that they're both important, because I believe that science can explain what makes us who we are, what makes us human beings. Science can explain why I was born the way that I was. And if we're willing to listen to the voice of scientists who are studying us and who are studying what makes us who we are, and psychologists, I believe that the majority of people, even a growing trend in the evangelical church, is understanding that people, for example, don't choose their sexuality or even their gender identity, that these are things that we don't have control over. And I think that that's important so that we can have these conversations from a place that is respectful and doesn't deny the existence of gay men and women. Fortunately, people don't deny my existence. I sometimes feel like I'm a prop in conversations like, well, what about intersex people? They didn't choose to be born that way. And that is a privilege that I have in these conversations that I don't take for granted. But science doesn't describe or explain or provide for us what makes us people, only what makes us human beings. And for me, faith is very important because it elevates me to the same field as everyone else. God does not love me more or less than anyone in this room. And I believe that that's awfully important, and it's as important a part of my identity as it's more important a part of my identity than being intersex or being trans or being male or female or anything else. It's the love of God, and I think that they are both such important parts of these conversations because they allow us to respect one another in ways that are terribly important.
Amen. Thank you. Justine, you have said before, and I've read in your book, which is great, I recommend it. You've said before that in a lot of ways you understood yourself to be a faithful person who then explored the science of sexuality, that your faith was what was deeply held and then you kind of explored some from there. What is it about human sexuality that calls us to use both the lens of faith and the lens of science?
Well, I mean, I could echo everything that's been said so far. For me, as a gay Christian, it's important, because I'm a Christian, it's important for me to understand what God wants me to do about the sort of raw materials that I've been given in life. We all have certain raw materials in terms of the bodies that we have, the brains that we have, the life experiences that we've had. And it's useless for me to say, well, I would like first to have different raw materials and then I'll serve God with them. I have the raw materials I have. And so my faith is about what do I do given that situation. But the science piece of it is important, as I think has already been said, for understanding that these are in fact the raw materials that I've got. I can't tell you how challenging it is, how frustrating it is, how frustrating it was for me when I first came out and started telling my Christian friends and family members and Christian leaders I respected that I thought I was gay. And I wasn't in a relationship, and I wasn't sexually active, and I didn't even know what the future held, but that I was exclusively attracted to the same sex, and always had been, and suspected that I might always be. And to have them basically say, no, you're not. Or, no, if you do this, then you won't be anymore. My roommate in college was addicted to South Park, and as a good Southern Baptist kid, I'd never watched South Park. Or The Simpsons.
I think The Simpsons are the gateway drug, and that's how you get from point A to point B. Not that I know, I've been told.
I still had not watched The Simpsons at this point, but he watched South Park and I couldn't sort of escape it. And I remember there was this episode from the first season of South Park where Stan finds out that his dog Sparky is gay. And he sits Sparky down and he tries to train the gay out of him. And he says, sit, Sparky, good boy. Now, shake, good boy. Now, don't be gay. Don't be gay, Spark, don't be gay. And Sparky just kind of goes, and Kyle says, did it work? And he says, I don't know. And Carmen says, he's pretty gay to me. But that was sort of my experience of the church. And the people who were saying these things to me were very well-meaning. They wanted me to, all the faith stuff was right, but they were making sort of a logical leap. They were starting from, well, I believe the Bible says that same-sex sex is wrong, and I believe that the Bible paints a certain picture of what marriage is and what sexuality is, and therefore I don't think God would make somebody gay and not give them a way to not be gay, and so it must not be. And here I am going, but this is my experience. I don't know what to tell you, it's my experience, I'm living it. I didn't think it could be either, but here I am. On the other hand, if we just look at it from just science, we could say, well, it is, therefore, to engage in a same-sex sexual relationship must be right. And my ultimate conclusion after years of Bible study is I actually do think that the church ought to allow for same-sex marriage, which I know is not the position of the Nazarene Church. But even though I think I do, that is the conclusion I ultimately came to, I don't think it is a good argument to say, because it is, therefore it must be. There are many things that we want, many things that we feel that, our faith says not to act on. So I think we have to have these two pieces working together to figure out what is and what do we do about it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Dr. Boone, I know you have thought and spoken and written a lot about this kind of convergence, human sexuality. Why faith and science? Why do both of those pieces matter for a holistic conversation?
I think your theological narrative of faith is what actually shapes the kind of viewpoint you have of science. Let me just give a couple of quick illustrations of that. In Reformed theology, which several of my friends here on the panel came out of Southern Baptist, Presbyterian, Reformed theological backgrounds. When you start with a John Calvin who has certain propositions, the whole tulip tree, and the sovereignty of God is primarily how you understand God, then the sovereignty of God needs an authoritative text which needs to support inviolatable propositions such that as you move through that, as I was reading Justïne's book on the plane coming over, it didn't surprise me that so many of your friends came straight to you with Scripture. I mean, it was just straight to you with Scripture, and with very narrowly chosen Scriptures beyond that. Because that's how a particular theological system based on theological proposition works. Well, when that system meets science, then all of a sudden every finding of science has to somehow fit within the theological propositions that have already been agreed upon. It's a very fixed world, and in some ways a very closed world. The theological tree that I come from, the Wesleyan tree, is a very different thing. We don't begin with a God who is sovereign. We begin with a God who is holy love, a covenant-making God. And as a result, Nazarenes across, our entire existence have really never spent a whole lot of time fighting about the inerrancy of the Bible, as if we somehow lose everything if something in the Bible is not literally the way that somebody propositionally believes that it is. So as a result, that kind of theological framework, a John Wesley, for instance, who took his Bible and opened it on the back of a horse and rode out into the world. And he understood the world through reading Scripture and Scripture through reading the world that he was in. And he took the Anglican faith and he tested it in the coal mines of England. And he collected the experiences of people around the doctrine of entire sanctification. This is a faith story that has more room within it for listening to the experiences that people have in terms of following and knowing and trusting God. So as a result, the faith narrative that I find myself in has a whole lot more space within it, not to somehow put science in a box over here that has to agree with all the propositions, but is able to trust that God is a God of holy love who wants to form covenant communities of people who love. And in the process of doing that, he has certainly given us a boundaried narrative with ethics in it and with practices that we practice and practices that we don't. But within the context of that, this God of holy love is after covenant. So science, for me, has never been something that had the constraints of my theology around it, but rather the deep belief that a God of holy love who has given us this kind of exploratory instinct is a God that can be trusted with when truth is found. One other just really quick thing. I think there's also the movement from modernism to postmodernism that is going on here. In modernism, science pretty well learned how to split the atom, how to literally take everything that is, break it down to its smallest parts, and then put it back together to create whatever we wanted to. In other words, we kind of learned to play God in modernism by what we did with things. And within postmodernism, there is the divergence of all the narratives, and people are listening to one another's stories a whole lot more. So when I think, for instance, about Exodus International and about ex-gay ministries that have come along, they are the perfect combination. They are the exact thing that you would predict that you would get out of a reformed propositional theology that needs to defend Scripture to be able to keep all the cards of the house standing. And on top of that, a modernism that says we can fix anything if we just get in here and figure it out and pull the parts together. We can fix anything. On the other side, I think the faith tradition that I stand in, it has a lot more flexibility in terms of how we encounter human beings and hear their experiences and learn from them. And so it's a theological system that, in all honesty, that holds faith and science not in a tug of war of sorts, but one actually feeds the other when I come at it from that particular part of my faith. Sorry, that's a little longer than I'll normally go.
Not a problem. All right, you have texted in roughly 1 bazillion questions. And you're doing great. Feel free to send them in. I guarantee you we will not get to them all. We will do as many as we possibly can.
We're going to take very fast.
I know. These people are quick with the thumbs. We will take our break now. We'll take 5 minutes, stretch your legs. There are restrooms and water fountains in the lobby behind you. We'll come back in 5, and we'll get straight to some of your questions. Thank you. All right, as I said before, we've gotten lots of great questions. I'm getting them in on my phone, which is why I keep looking at it, and we will just get to as many as we possibly can. Dr. Boone, I wanted to start with you. You mentioned about halfway through that you'd been a part of working on the authorship committee for the new statement on human sexuality for the Church of the Nazarene. I know that new statement is considerably more gracious and inclusive in some ways than some of its predecessors. Can you talk to us just briefly about that process and how you helped to draft it and the kinds of things that went into that transition?
Yeah, one of the interesting things about that particular group is when you do legislation as a Nazarene, you do it globally. So our global brothers and sisters are in many ways in some different places than American Christianity is regarding issues of homosexuality in particular. So it was an international group of people that worked on that together. We knew we wanted to come from a statement. Really, the manual of the Church of the Nazarene had no coherent statement on human sexuality to start with. So as we were doing that, our sense was, let's first say what we do believe, and then let's talk about the good news. It's basically how I put sermons together. You have to identify what the good news is of this God and what this God does, what this God is like. Then you want to talk about the ways in which we are broken by the cultures that we live in, by our practices, by sin at every different level, and just name the brokenness that's in the world. And then we wanted to move to a very redemptive closing statement. So it's built on, it's a narrative that's built on that sense of beginning with God and the intentions of a good God and a good creation, moving toward the fall of humankind, the ways that we've broken ourselves, and then trying to get to that sense. It was a joy to work on that group. There's not a single person on that group that got everything they wanted in that statement. And some of the folk at the early stages said, there is no way in the world we will come out with a statement that will pass an international assembly of Christians coming from all the different nations and everything. So it was something of a miracle when there was a 97% affirming vote of that particular statement. And while there are parts of it, I think I would have said it a little differently, and I won't even tell you what they are. It's something that I think demonstrated a church trying to move in a much more graceful direction than what we had in the past.
Excellent, thank you. Justin and Justine, it was brought to my attention, and so I'm passing the buck to you, as it were. We don't want to make any baseline assumptions about people's familiarity with human sexuality or some of the terms that we use in English to describe it. And so could you please, in whatever way seems best to you, break down a little bit for us when we say LGBT+, when we talk about LGBTQIA, what are those, what does that acronym mean? And how does that introduce us into a broader conversation? But let's start at the very beginning.
Right. So you hear this acronym a lot, LGBT, some variation thereof. And I do try to define this when I speak to crowds because invariably somebody will say, I don't know what LGBT means, and I always explain it is a BLT with guacamole, and it is delicious.
I do love guacamole.
It's really good on a BLT. This is true. But also variations of this acronym are used to describe the larger community. So I think I'm going to talk about the LGB piece of this, and Justine's going to talk about the other pieces. So
that's the lettuce and the guacamole.
Yeah, the lettuce, guacamole, and bacon.
Okay.
The best parts. Because who doesn't love lettuce? So LGBT and the other letters have, but the L is for lesbian, G is for gay, B is for bisexual, T is for transgender, and we'll continue on. But when I call myself gay, what I mean very specifically is that my physical, sexual, romantic, etc. attractions are for people of the same sex rather than people of the opposite sex. It is not a statement about some kind of cultural identity I'm taking on. It is not a statement about if I'm sexually active or who I would be sexually active with. A gay person, just like a straight person, can be celibate or not celibate. Having, sex with someone does not change the orientation that you have. Some gay women use the term gay, some use the term lesbian, some use both. And bisexual means basically someone who has attraction to both men and women. Some people will use the term pansexual as a broader term, sort of talking about the broader spectrum of gender identity. But that's sort of the pieces of sexual orientation.
Great.
Oh, and let me also add A for asexual, for folks who do not experience that sexual attraction.
Absolutely. Justine?
Oh, I get the tomato and all the side dishes. It's kind of important to explain the difference between sex and gender. Sex is your biological, what you are born as male or female. So animals have sexes as well, and some animals have lots of different kinds and variations thereon as well. Check out mollusks, they're fascinating. But humans generally, myself excluded from this, tend to be male or female. If you are male or female at birth, you are dyadic, or as I like to call you guys, hermaphrodites.
Thank you.
If you are transsexual, then it means that you would like to undergo, so there's different terms that go out from there, but it means that you are undergoing physical changes or intend to undergo physical changes to become the opposite sex. So you might go through hormone replacement therapy, you might undergo surgery. There are terms that are kind of being phased out where they would say pre-op or post-op or non-op, referring to whether or not you're about to have surgery, or if you've had surgery, or if you're not going to pursue surgery. So there's, that is sex. Gender, or including transgender, gender refers to our social role. So what pronouns are you referred to as? Usually you'll have a name that reflects your gender more often than not. What clothing you wear might reflect your gender. All of these things are a part of your gender. So if you are transgender, that means that you lived as one gender, male or female, and then you transitioned to another gender. So in my case, as an intersex person, intersex refers to you being born with physical components of both male and female reproductive anatomies. So in my case, I was born with male and female components on my person. I have had sexual reconstruction to be completely female, but as a person who was born intersex, technically, I mean, I don't take umbrage to being referred to as transsexual. It doesn't offend me at all, but it's more appropriate to say that I am intersex, but I'm also transgender because I spent the first 25 years of my life male and then became female. So I hope that that doesn't create too much confusion. You're free to grab me after this if you need a better breakdown.
Can I just add one thing from what Justine was talking about? I think it's also important to, and maybe everyone knows this, but it seems to me an awful lot of people I meet don't. It's different to talk about one's sexual orientation and one's sexual behavior. Sexual behavior does often involve choices, and people can make some pretty strange choices in life, as I think any of us can recognize. But that's, you can have homosexual or heterosexual or all kinds of other sexual behaviors and not have an orientation towards whoever or whatever you're having sex with. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Could I also add a little bit as well? And I wanted to speak a little bit more to what Justine's talking about in terms of the transgender piece, because it's also not just binary like you're female or you're male, but there's, if you more can think of it like as a wheel, perhaps, where it's that people may fall in all kinds of places around their gender identity, which is how they identify themselves as, in terms of kind of constructs around masculine, feminine. And so, for instance, sometimes I have a number of kids that we treat that may be, they're born as one sex, female, male, that's how we identify people. And they are moving along kind of a spectrum of transition, and they are not necessarily sure that they want to completely become the opposite gender. So where people are at in terms of their own process is kind of unique, and I think kind of identifying and respecting that as well is pretty important as we have these discussions.
Absolutely. I'd like to stay.
Can I ask one quick
Sure.
question? Justine, I've always wanted to ask this. You may be, the two of you might be able to help me. I've heard people talk about the LGBTQ, that you have to almost draw a line in the middle, that LGB is more about an external attraction, and the trans and intersex are more about an internal understanding of who you are. Is there within the LGBTQ community an understanding that these are viewed as different things in that way? Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, and gender identity and your sexual orientation, they are completely separate. I know a trans woman, was born physically entirely male, transitioned to female and is undergoing surgery. She is attracted to women. So she will be becoming a woman and will also continue to date women. And her gender identity was so strongly transgender that it's very important for her to undergo hormone replacement therapy. She had surgery on her voice to raise the pitch of her voice, and she's going through gender reconstruction surgery or sexual reconstruction surgery, all of that, because her gender identity is so profoundly female. But she is exclusively attracted to women as far as I'm aware. So they are two very different things. They're very different issues, and I thank you for pointing that out, that one is more of an internal issue and one has to do with like your partner preference.
Dr. Pitt and Reiner, I'd like to come back to you. In your experience and in your practice, what are some common misconceptions about human sexuality? What are things that might surprise us who haven't done that kind of research or been in that kind of practice? How common are conditions like intersex? What is gender dysphoria? Can you unpack those for us just a little bit, and where they have occurred in your practice, and how you have helped people with those kinds of conditions and situations?
You want me to start? I can talk about the concrete issues. There are many, many, many variations among people, as I think all of us realize. There are many variations genetically, and there are some variations chromosomally, meaning that, well, the reason I say there are some variations is that most variations chromosomally lead to demise of the embryo or the fetus so that they're not born. In terms of intersex, I think Justine hit on it just about right, and that is that you have some kinds of anatomical structures that are male or female, or it may be something that it's not quite clear what they are. And those are conditions that have two major effects lead to your anatomy, is the way I should put it. The genetics, the genetic part of it is very, very important, because everyone starts off, all embryos develop into a female-looking sort of fetus. But whether the fetus ends up looking male at birth or female at birth has to do with the exposure to the internal exposure or external exposure to hormones. And in particular, male hormones in the proper amount and at the proper timing lead to the development of male structures and the disappearance of the internal female structures. There's actually three hormones that are involved in that, two male hormones and then one other hormone. If there is an error in, the way I like to put it is that if someone is inappropriately masculinized or virilized, or if someone is inadequately virilized, that is, if someone has male hormone exposure who shouldn't be having it in terms of who they are, or if someone doesn't have enough male hormone exposure in terms of who they are, they're going to have an intersex condition. Does that make sense? That went over like like a very old guacamole. Well, just looking at it anatomically, we can ignore anything else, the physiology and the brain and other things, hard to ignore, but we'll ignore them for a moment. If a typical male is born and looks like a typical male, so that they have a fairly narrow pelvic outlet, although that can be hard to see without an x-ray. They have a penis, a foreskin, a urethra that goes out to the tip of the penis, and a scrotum and two descended testicles. Internally, they have some other male structures as well. A female newborn looks like a typical female with a clitoris and labia, with a urethral opening that sits on the actual body itself, not separate, and then has a separate vaginal opening. And the vaginal position and the anal position is closer to the vagina and farther forward in the body than it is in the male. So anything that interrupts the development of the male leads to, or starts to develop a male when there shouldn't be a male development, leads to anatomical structures that are in between and are not typical. So if you have an enlarged clitoris, if you have a very small penis and the urethra is in the wrong, the opening to the urinary opening is in the wrong place, does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And you can see other things. I mean, there are rare cases where a boy can be born looking absolutely like a normal male. This is very rare. Normal foreskin, normal urethra, normal scrotum, but no descended testicles. In fact, no palpable testicle, no gonads that can be felt at all. And in fact, that may be a genetic female with a single gene defect that if you don't figure it out pretty darn close to birth, the kid's going to die. So it's very important when a baby is born looking like a male with you can't feel any testicles, you got to make sure that that kid's going to survive the first 7 to 10 days of their life before you worry about anything else. So those are very important things to look for, and that is a condition of intersex, or can be.
Excellent, thank you. Dr. Pitt, how would you speak to conditions like gender dysphoria, or to the ways that you've seen psychological manifestations of people wrestling with what may be initially shaped by physiological conditions?
So I think this is where psychology and science become, they're a little blurry, and I will do my best to help with some of this. But scientifically, what we're learning is that over the years that it may be some of these hormones, prenatally exposure to hormones that help with the formation of sexual identity and gender identity. And so what I see are kids that are coming to me. We start working with kids that are 10. So I'm seeing kids as young as 10. We're seeing some kids that are younger than 10 that are coming to us with issues around their sexual identity and gender identity, and that they're ready to address. Gender dysphoria is something that happens when someone is trying to work out their gender identity. And if you remember what we talked about just a minute ago, gender identity is kind of, it's knowing who you are as far as how you relate to kind of feminine and masculine concepts, and what that means for you personally, what it means in your family, what it means socially. And just working that out within yourself, and every one of us goes through that process. But for people who are what we call cisgender, which is the term for your biological sex matches your internal identity, you really don't realize and pay attention to that process. It's something that you go through. For a child who's struggling with gender identity, it's a struggle. I use the word struggle purposefully because it doesn't match for them. Whatever biological sex they've been assigned at birth doesn't match with what their internal monitor says about who they are. And so when kids are coming to me, it's a concern because the suicide rate for this mismatch is 25 times higher than it is for the typical adolescent population. That's big. The typical adolescent population, 20% of kids attempt suicide. So I'm talking 25 times higher, not percent higher, times higher, in kids who are struggling with their gender identity. The dysphoric part leads to, dysphoria means that it's about the struggle piece of it, where it's like, how do I work this through? What does this mean for me? People's acceptance of me, coming out to my parents and talking about this. How do I get help moving toward making how I appear match with what I feel on the inside? So there are lots of issues that come along with gender identity, and these kids sometimes get very depressed. They get very anxious. They are more prone to having other kinds of psychological kinds of disorders comorbidly. So it's very important that we deal with the issue of gender identity and understanding really the scientific origins of it and where this goes if we don't do something to help people.
Excellent, thank you very much. Question for Justine and Justine, and I'd like to hear from both of you in whichever order. How do I approach the topic of my own minority sexuality with my conservative Christian parents?
Oh.
Wow.
Wow, okay. Can I have like an hour for that one?
Let's see, we've got 54 minutes.
What's funny is some of the people out there laughed and then we're kind of like, I hope he's not serious about taking that long. Right, so there's not a short answer to this, but I'll give you the shortest answer I can. It's difficult, and it's different for every family. It's different I mean, a lot has to do with you and how comfortable you are having this conversation, and your parents, and what they believe and why they believe it. When I told my parents that I was gay, it was incredibly difficult. And I wrote about this a bit in my book, if you want to hear the rest of the story. I told a pastor in my church and asked if he would help me tell my parents, because I was so scared. And I wasn't afraid that they would, like, disown me. I know some people that is a real fear. Some people have been disowned by their parents, have been kicked out of the house, or, you know, written out of the will or whatever. My relationship with my parents was strong enough that I wasn't worried about that, but I had been the golden boy. I mean, I was, you know, I was God boy. My parents were so proud of me. I was the good Christian kid, and I was about to tell them this thing that did not fit with their image of the good Christian kid at all. And I was terrified, and so I didn't want to lose their respect. So I asked this pastor if he would help, and so this was like a week before I left for college. I was out of high school, and I was like, I'll tell my parents, and then get out.
In retrospect, healthy, not healthy?
It depends on where you are. I think it depends on your relationship with your parents in the situation. So I asked this pastor to help, and he invited them to his office. They didn't know why they were going to be there. The plan was for me to be there already when they got there, and then my dad, my parents were going to be leaving soon, asked if I would do some chores, and I stupidly said, oh, sure, and then realized I couldn't, so I had to sneak out of the house to go to church to get there before my parents. I'd never snuck out of the house before, but I had to do it to go to church.
That's how God boy sneaks out of the house.
So yeah, I got caught sneaking out of the house and had to leave anyway. So I sat there in that space, and all I could really get out was that I was gay, and I didn't know what else to say. And then I thankfully had this pastor who had some knowledge. In retrospect, not as much knowledge as I wish he'd had. But he was at least able to be another person, a more neutral party who my parents respected, who could help. But over the years, I mean, it was not a simple thing with my parents. It took a long time. We had a lot of conversations. There were times that we couldn't even talk about it. There were times that we fought horribly about it. They kept thinking that I had turned my back on God, or not so much that I turned my back on God, but that I didn't believe that God had the power to change me. And my response was, I believe that God has the power to do anything, but God does not seem to be in the business of changing people's orientation, and is not changing mine. And I've been praying about this for many years, and God is not giving me any indication that that's the direction that I should be going. But it was really tough. And I wish that I had more resources for them. There are more resources available now than there were. And I wrote my book partly as a resource for those conservative parents. Later on, you know, if we talk about resources, I'll say more about that. But also, if you want to get in touch with me before this is over, I'll give out my web address and stuff, and I'm happy to point you to resources for parents. But I think the best thing you can do is be patient with them, give them resources that speak their language with their faith background. So my evangelical parents, it was really important for me to give them resources that spoke to them as evangelicals. And also to understand that when they said things that were really hurtful to me, it wasn't out of a lack of love. It was in many cases, parents see a child's sexual orientation or gender identity or something not as a part of the child that they don't like, which is how the child usually perceives it, but as some external force that's like a danger, like a cancer to their child that they want to get rid of for the sake of their child, and they don't understand why this is so hurtful. And so often they say things that are said in love that are really painful, and sometimes as much as you're not in the right place to hear this, sometimes what you have to do is, in the midst of your pain, take a step back and go, try to understand where they're coming from and why they're saying what they do and what they believe, rather than responding in hurt, even if it hurts. So that's the shortest answer I can give you, even though it's only scratching the surface.
That's great. Thank you. Justine, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I do second also what Justin is saying about your parents may react very negatively because they love you. And if your parents come from a very conservative evangelical background, it's hard for you that your parents genuinely care about your soul and they feel that your soul is in danger. And it's going to probably be an ongoing issue that, yes, providing them resources or finding members of churches that are very affirming and helpful, that can speak their language, is very helpful, but that is going to be a process. And knowing that before you approach them. My father was concerned for me that I wouldn't find somebody who would love me. And it hurt to hear him say that, and in the way that he said it, but it was genuine concern for me. While I heard, well, my father doesn't think that I deserve somebody who's going to marry me and love me in spite of all of this, it was a genuine concern, even if the way it came out was hurtful. So being aware of that before going into the conversation, I think, is very helpful. And I also second the sentiment that finding a church that will love you and provide care, and maybe having a neutral party in the room, being able to answer questions if you're dealing with a gender identity disorder, being able to explain to your parents how long you felt that way. You may have felt that way for as long as you literally can remember, or maybe not, but being able to explain how immutable this part of who you are is, and being able to have answers ready for those questions that are going to come out. I think that goes a long way.
And having a support network too. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the church, but like just in terms of friends, people who can be there for you, because it's anytime you're having difficult conversations, even if you're not, anywhere on the LGBT plus, spectrum, if some of these conversations are really painful to have, and it's easy to get angry and upset, and I find that the best way to like keep your cool is to, be as much as you can, pray and trust Christ, in that moment, to be that like listening ear to somebody as they say things that you may find really frustrating, and then go and like have your friends who support you, who you can like vent to. That can be really important, so you don't have to do this all alone.
Can I say
And-
one? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes. Well, one last thing is the It Gets Better campaign, is coming from a really good point too. Maybe if you're in junior high or high school, maybe you can't wait until college or after college in my case, but these conversations do become easier as, you are out of the house already, or I don't know. You will know what the best time is for you, I trust, but if it's really looking like it could be a bad situation, I don't want to push anyone in front of a bus. Maybe the best time for you to tell your parents is at 25. Maybe not. That's something that you're going to have to weigh and sort out with fear and trembling. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that just parents are going through their process too. This is these processes are processes for families. And so kind of keeping perspective too, that as people are going through everyone goes through their own process, the adolescent is going through their process, the adult's going through their process, everyone around them is going through a process as well too, and coming to know that adolescent, that adult as the person that they are. And so just being able to keep that perspective in mind, because those parents are going to need support as well.
Absolutely. I think I'd like to hear from Dr. Reiner and from Dr. Boone, kind of two different, perhaps, takes on the same question. How would you help prepare parents for children who are coming out, or for children who are experiencing gender dysphoria, or for children who are transgender because of an intersex condition? How would you speak to parents about what it's like to be a safe and a loving place for their kids to maybe express themselves fully for the first time or differently for the first time?
It's, I hate to say this, but it's very individual, just as the kids are individuals. Preparing the parents rather, is difficult most of the time. I'd say almost all of the time. And in some ways, preparing the mother and preparing the father may be very different. Sometimes, not very often, but sometimes it may be better to start with one parent and then start with the mother generally, and then work towards the father. I think what's important really are the points that Justin and Justine have already made. I think it's very important to prepare the parents for what they have come to realize, Justin and Justine that is, that they love their child. That's not going to change. Their child loves them, but more to the point, needs them and needs their love, and that's not going to change. One of the things I point out to parents often in the preparation stage is that I work with so many kids who were males born without a penis or males or females with intersex. And sometimes the parents will have made comments, something to the effect that, well, gee, we went through 9 months of pregnancy or however long, and this isn't what we expected. And I have to point out to them that no child ever is who you expected. In fact, when a child is born, you haven't got a clue about who or what that child is other than what you can physically or optically see. So I try to get those points. It depends also partly on the age of the child. I mean, if I have an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old, it's going to be different than if I have a kid who's a week before going off to college, which is a little tough. But I have had that experience. I've had kids who have gone into a major depression and become suicidal during their first year in college and had to be hospitalized, who then basically told me things, and then I'd say, how would you like me to help you? And sometimes they say, well, actually, I want you to tell my parents. I said, oh, wait a minute, did I get it? I didn't sign up for that, did I? But there's all variations. So I think it is individual, but what you have to do is to get across the realities. And by the way, there are some times where you can't get them across. There are some people who just don't understand. I had a number of years ago, I had a young adolescent male who had recognized his sexual orientation at a young age. I don't remember how young, 10 or 12 or 13. And he had been he had had sexual experiences, and at the same time, his father wouldn't accept that he was gay. And the father kept saying that this was a phase. I said, a phase? I thought, isn't that something you do in Star Trek? You phase? No, maybe that's not it. I don't know what a phase is, but I tried to point out to the father that this kid when he came to see me, this kid was not half-baked, this kid was fully baked, and the father had to, well, it never worked. Let me just say that I and 2 other people worked with the father for probably a year, and I don't know who gave up, we or us or the father, but and by the way, the child brought the father to see me. That's unusual. Usually the parents bring the child to a child psychiatrist. This was one where the child found me somehow and then brought the father in.
Wow, thank you. Dr. Boone, how would you speak to parents in those kinds of situations?
Now, I think, let me approach the question pastorally. The previous question regarding I'm a Christian young person, and I want to tell my conservative Christian parents that I'm gay or the thing I think I'd want to say is being a parent with a deep understanding of what family means and what covenant means. Every parent is going to respond by trying to fix the problem that their child brings to them. And I think for a teenager who has a certain response back from parents who immediately move into the fixing mode, they move into the diagnosing mode and then the fixing mode, I would say to the young person, recognize that this is a signal that your parent loves you, even though that's not what you needed in that particular moment. But it is an expression of love. I mean, my 3 daughters are now 30 to 40, and Denise tells me one of their cars broke down on the interstate somewhere. I mean, I'm in diagnosing and fixing mode immediately, just immediately. So there is a sense in which that parent-child dynamic has to expect that the loving parent is probably going to respond in some kind of fixing mode to start with. How would I help that parent be able to move from that prescribing and fixing mode to, I think, what would be a much more helpful way? I think I would take them to the way that God loves. I would try to help them see that the God who loves us is not a God who rushes in and fixes everything around us. This is a God that gives us great freedom, and that it is the power of the way that God loves us that ultimately changes the situations that we're in. And so I would point them to some kind of model of the way that God loves as the way that they should respond in this particular situation. They may not find, they're afraid. Can I just tell you, they're afraid. They're dealing with something that the generation ahead of them very rarely dealt with. They are, parents are pretty well modernly stained, which means you tear this apart and you get the right help in, and you get my kid to the right doctor and the right psychologist and the right counselor and the right revival service and the right youth speaker, and we're going to get this thing fixed. While it's the wrong strategy, it is the way that love instinctively would act. And I think I would try to help a parent understand this is what your instincts are, but let's look at your child. Let's see what your child needs in this particular moment, and see if you cannot learn from the way that God loves a different way, to hear them, to surround them with an unfailing, never-ending love, I will be there with you. Even the sense of the love of God that we see in the cross of Christ, where he stands in the places where we stand and suffers in the places where we suffer. And this is a God whose presence in suffering is non-ending. So I think that's what I do pastorally to try to help.
And I think the aspect that you mentioned of fixing the child, that is a huge part of parenting. You're absolutely right, and it doesn't go away when your kids reach 40 or probably any other age. When I was in pediatric urology, I was always amazed at the parents who would bring their child in to be fixed surgically. And then when I switched to pediatric psychiatry, I found that the parents would bring their child in to be fixed with a medicine, a pill. I tried to point out to them in a gentle way, in an educational way, that I couldn't fix their children in either case, but I could help work with the child or work with the parents or work with the school or whoever, work with all of them if necessary, to try to work on issues so that everybody was getting along better.
Thank you so much. Justin and Justine, kind of a related follow-up question. Recognizing, as Dr. Reiner and Boone have, that we don't even all agree on what brokenness means or what needs to be fixed, and what those categories are. What are ways in which you perhaps wish that your parents had been better equipped by the church to receive you lovingly? Or what ways would you hope that parents in general might be better equipped by the church to receive children who are sexual minorities of one kind or another? Generally or specifically, no need to speak to your parents in particular, but what might you hope that we as the church could do to help parents more lovingly receive their kids, as Dr. Boone has said, with the love that is unconditional, that reflects the love of God?
I think there's a lot of pressure on members of our churches of any age to conform to a certain culture. And I think that that creates a lot of pressure on our parents to ensure that we conform. And I think that some parents almost feel a sense of embarrassment if their child comes out of the closet or acts a certain way or doesn't fit in. And I think that for a church to lovingly or to equip our parents to raise us in the church is to accept us however we are and whatever we are, because the church doesn't agree with what's fixed and what isn't, and what should be changed, or what is the parent's fault and what your child is born with. The church doesn't agree on that. And I'm not expecting that to happen anytime soon. But I think that our churches, including our Sunday school teachers, our youth pastors, our senior pastors, accepting anyone and anyone's children, however they identify, as members of the congregation, regardless of what your theology is, but keeping the church doors open to these people and their children, I think is going to be awfully important, because parents don't need judgment, they need support. And issues of all sexual minorities, whether you're intersex or whether you have a gender identity dysphoria or whether you're homosexual, these things are terribly private situations that parents deal with at home. They're not dealing with that. And they may not be dealing with it in a healthy way, but it's not the job of your congregation to add to that stress. I see it as an issue that is created by our society that creeps into our families. The church need not perpetuate that.
Thank you very much. Justin, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said. I appreciate that. I keep trying to come up with something funny to say because I feel so tense right now. Like, this is such a deep and challenging conversation. And I'm kind of emotional right now because these are really hard conversations for a lot of us. And this is about people's lives. And I think for all of us, not just for parents, but for the church as a whole, what I would really like to see us do on these conversations about sexual orientation and gender identity, and gender and sex and all of it, is to depoliticize and desexualize these conversations. Even when we're talking about sexual orientation, when I tell you that I'm gay, I'm not making a political statement. I'm not kind of planting a flag as an activist for some cause. I might have a cause. I do have causes. But when I tell you I'm gay, I'm not doing that. And I'm not telling you anything about my sex life or lack thereof. I'm not telling you anything about me sexually, even though I'm telling you something about my sexual orientation, if that makes sense. I'm just trying to tell you who I am. And particularly when you're young and you're trying to figure out what your future looks like, sometimes even when you're older, you're trying to figure out what your future looks like. It's so dehumanizing to say, this is who I am, this is a piece of me that you didn't know about me. This is something I've been thinking about and aware of for so many years, and it's been this private part of me for so long. And I trust you enough that I want to tell you about what's been going on in my life. And to have someone respond as if I said, let me tell you my political stance on a controversial issue in the church or in society or whatever. And there's this instant like, okay, let me tell you the Bible passages for why you're wrong, or let me tell you what our church's position is or whatever. I wish we as a church could cultivate the ability to sit and just have a conversation and tell stories and say, you know what, you've just shared something with me. Let me hear your story right now. And then let me tell you my story. Because there are real theological disagreements. And I'm not saying let's gloss over those theological disagreements. It matters. To me, as a Christian, it matters what our position is on some of these issues. And, so I'm not saying ignore that. But for the moment, when I look at how Jesus treated people, Jesus doesn't immediately come in and say, let me tell you where all your theology is wrong. Jesus says, let me come to your house for dinner. Let me get to know you. And that's so often not been my experience in the church. And I've known so many people who have taken their own lives or who have lived for so many years in depression because they think that people don't actually want to know them. And that's what we've got to change, so that when someone comes out to their parents, that it's not immediately a political, sexual, social issue, theological issue I have to have a position on. We can get to that. But that the very first reaction we have is, this is something I didn't know about this person, and I love this person, so let me learn more about what their journey is, and then let me join you on that journey, and let's take it together. And then we'll work out the rest of it together.
It's beautiful.
I've got sort of a follow-up question for Justine, and then Drs. Pitt and Reiner will pivot back to you and to more kind of the science end of this conversation. But Justine, experientially, how did you or how do you reconcile a loving God with the non-loving actions of others, specifically Christians, some of them, without being bitter? How did you get from that place of hurt to a place of peace and of forgiveness?
Well, there are days when I am bitter. I think that if God blessed me with anything, it's the superpower of surrounding myself with people who have my best interest at heart and who love me. I found the majority of those people either in church or at SNU of all places, and those people are still a part of my life, and I call them my family. I call them my brothers and my sisters, even though we're not biologically related, because they became family to me. If those people hadn't been in my life, I would have been one of the many intersex and trans people who took their own lives during college. And God putting those people in my life is how I reconcile a loving God in spite of the church's response after college. There are also churches that still demonstrate God's love and Christ's love for us that are open and affirming. And I go to one of those churches today. My future in ministry wasn't what I thought it was going to be at SNU. I thought I was going to be a missionary to Poland for the Church of the Nazarene, and I am the president of a neighborhood association for an inner city urban area instead, and I'm working in a very secular environment. And I don't know what the future of the Methodist Church will be, if it will be opening and affirming to LGBT clergy or not, or if that would affect me or not. I know that I am doing good in the world right now as it is, and it's good that I'm doing without the Church of the Nazarene right now. Maybe a day will come when I can do good in the world with their partnership. But I see Christ through individuals that have come into my life and that have saved me and changed my life and modeled Christ's love to me. And I encourage all of you who are Christians who are in this room today to demonstrate that love to everyone in your life, because you may not know what they're struggling with.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Drs. Pitt and Reiner, we are grounding all of these important conversations about faith and about community and about faith communities and how important they are in science as well. And so one of the questions that I got was from someone who clearly paid more attention in biology class than I did. I'll put that up front. In high school, we're taught that sexuality is dictated by X and Y chromosomes. How has our understanding of science developed beyond that and in addition to that? How is this a more nuanced conversation than just X and Y?
You do keep asking a lot of simple questions, don't you? Well, X and Y are nice. I mean, if you have two X's, that's nice, and two Y's, that's nice. You can have three X's and a Y, and you can have, I mean, all kinds of variations because that's what happens in life. X and Y, typically, an XY, a person with 46 chromosomes, one of which is an X and one of which is a Y, typically is a boy who grows up and is heterosexual and probably gets married, or actually today they probably don't get married, but has sex and has kids without being married. I don't really understand that, but that's a different issue.
Different conversation.
Won't go into my own children at all here. But that's hardly written in stone, and it isn't really the X and the Y that are determined. I'm not saying that they aren't important. I hate to say this to you guys, but the X is far more important than the Y.
We know.
That's right, that's right. But at any rate, other than determining what sex you are, it's not a simple, who you are and what you are and how you behave is just anything but simple. I recently saw an interview of Patricia Churchill. I don't know if any of you know who she is, but she's a philosopher at the University of California, San Diego, who is in the neuroscience department. And when I first heard that, I scratched my head and I said, what? Okay, never mind. Then I saw her interviewed and she promptly explained how neuroscience is going to be able to explain everything about us, who we are, what we are, how we are, our identities. I thought, goodness gracious, I don't know where this woman came from, but not from our world. Nothing is that simple. There are many things about us that are not explainable scientifically at all. They're often explainable from a faith standpoint, but not from a science standpoint. Leo Strauss was a philosopher who gave a talk once in Jerusalem, I think it was 1959, and he made the comment that there are some things, identity being one of them, but I'm putting that out myself, there are some things that every 10-year-old boy or girl innately understands and knows that science can't explain and won't be able to explain because they really can't, they don't have a question to ask. So if you ask me, or if I ask you who you are, any one of you who you are, that's, in other words, explaining really who you are in terms of identity. You could spend days telling me who you are, and I would, at the end of days of talking, you'd be exhausted and probably run out of vocabulary, and I wouldn't be able to hear anymore. And I would have a much better understanding of who you are, but not really know who you are, because the only person who knows who you are is you. So, you know, if you want to ask what is consciousness, what is identity, all of these things, we're not going to be able to explain them, but they're incredibly complex. And those kinds of questions are built into every aspect of your anatomy, so to speak, every aspect of your body. So looking to science for answers to those questions I find a little bit absurd. We'll be able to give a few answers to some processes, but big deal. I think this is the issue where faith becomes critical, and people who are spiritually lost, I think, are lost in a very broad way in terms of who they are and where they are in life and where they're going to go. And I don't mean to heaven or hell, I mean just in terms of behaviors. So I think that X and Y chromosomes are usually associated with, two X's are usually associated with being a female, and X and Y is usually associated with being a male. But humans are much more complex than that. And who we are and what we are and how we got there is much more complex than that. And every single person, I hate to sound like I'm being trite or saying a cliche, but every single person really is a separate identity. My father was an identical twin, and yet my father and my uncle were not quite the same. I mean, their hips deteriorated at the exact same rate, their hearts had exactly the same problem at the exact same time, and despite the fact that their lifestyle, whatever that is, was really quite different. And they had a lot of similarities in their likes and dislikes and their interests, but they were not exactly the same people by any means. So your question is incredibly difficult, but one that I'm really not going to answer, so that's okay.
All right. Dr. Pitt, help me out here. I did not pay very close attention in high school biology at all. What are the complexities beyond what we might get in a very simplistic understanding of sexuality and of chromosomes and the role that they play? What are those complexities, and how do those complexities shape who we become?
Gosh, it's a super complicated question. There are not going to be any really clear-cut answers. We are learning more, I think, with science about development, the human development and what happens. So we are gaining some ground in understanding. But, when we started this conversation, I said that I think part of my knowledge is knowing what we don't know, what I don't know. What we don't know is the science. And there's a lot that we don't know. It's complex because we're not talking about just biology either. We're also talking about social factors. We're talking about psychological factors, environmental context. There's so much more that we're talking about here than just biology too. So when you start putting all those pieces together, it's a really intricate puzzle. And as those pieces it's how those pieces are kind of put together as to how people move along in each individual process. That goes for everybody sitting out in this audience, everybody on this panel. It doesn't matter. We're all kind of woven of these different pieces. And so I can't give you a simple explanation. I can tell you that science is kind of moving in terms of their understanding of the biological contributors and some of the social contextual contributors to who we are. But it is a different answer for every person, I will tell you that as well.
Thank you very much. Justine and Dr. Boone, I'd like to hear from both of you, maybe two different parts of the same question. Justine, you used language earlier talking about the distinctives between welcoming Christian churches and affirming Christian churches. Could you unpack that distinction for me and talk a little bit about what an affirming church might offer? And then Dr. Boone, can you talk about what it means to be from a tradition that is welcoming but not affirming, but what it means to be loving and gracious within that context as well?
So an open and affirming church would be a church that, I don't know how familiar people are with like side A, side B of the gay Christianity debate, but there are churches that do not believe that if you are gay, you are going to go to hell for either being gay or for acting on your sexuality by having a romantic partnership with a member of the same sex. These churches would support same-sex marriage and believe that the gay community should be able to marry, have children if they so choose, and live out the same life that any heterosexual person is entitled to do within a Christian context. And that
so within the same kind of covenantal language,
yes.
monogamy,
monogamy,
et cetera.
Marriage, the sacrament of marriage, all of that it's the same standard for the gay community and for the straight community. That is what an affirming church is. It's not the same as a welcoming church, though it is welcoming. A welcoming church is a church that says, regardless of who you are welcome to come and worship and find God in this church and in this congregation. And while that wasn't enough for me, because I wanted to know that I could invite a gay friend to church, and if that gay friend became a Christian and grew in Christ and wanted to teach Sunday school or preach or whatever, that they would be able to live out all of the fullness of church membership that I am entitled to. There are churches that are still welcoming, even if there are some parameters on to what extent you're encouraged to be involved in leadership, even if they teach these teachings that our church isn't compatible with homosexuality. They do not turn anyone away from becoming a part of their congregation and still worshiping and learning. And there is a lot that is to be gained just from being a part of a community and making friends and having a church family, that regardless of your stance on homosexuality or transgender issues, you can still offer to someone whatever your theology is on that subject.
So for someone who's part of the LGBT community and is in a married relationship, in an affirming church, membership would be open to them, marriage would be open to them,
Right.
Ordination would be open to them.
Right, ordination as well. Although there are, for example, in the UMC, the United Methodist Church, there is kind of a split going on. It's really interesting to watch in the Methodist Church. Our congregation is an open and affirming congregation within a denomination that is not yet there. So we recently had to decide, what do? We have a lesbian couple that wants to get married, and this is their home church. This is where they met. They want to get married in this church and in this sanctuary, even though we don't have a center aisle. They still want to do all of that here. And our pastor, because he's not quite union yet, could lose his ordination. And as someone who has been defrocked, I understand that he didn't want to perform that ceremony. So we had to decide, what are we going to do about this? And so there are challenges that some open and affirming congregations have if the denomination is not open and affirming. So while there are churches, I believe the Presbyterian Church and the Episcopalian Church, the Anglican Church outside of England, I believe that these churches do ordain gay clergy. The Methodist Church is not quite there yet, but there are congregations that are sort of an open rebellion that are open and affirming nonetheless. So it's an interesting dynamic, I suppose.
Thank you. Dr. Boone, the Church of the Nazarene is currently a welcoming denomination, and that is in some ways a more gracious developmental step than some of the ways we have articulated that in the past. What can we offer and what should we offer as a welcoming denomination? How can we be loving and gracious even though our denominational polity may not be that of some of our Christian brothers and sisters?
I think, in all honesty, the first thing I would have to say is a lot of our Nazarene congregations aren't even welcoming. So it's not like as a denomination we have gotten there to start with. I would also say that welcoming and affirming occurs in multiple different ways in the different families of the Christian church. For instance, I would go to a Southern Baptist church. They would not be welcoming and affirming of my daughters receiving the call of God to pastoral ministry and actually being able to be ordained and preached within that context. I would go to the Catholic. We'll do that on another conference, okay? I'm with you, sister.
Promise?
I go to the Catholic church and I'm with my friends and I walk in the communion line and I get to the front and I have to do this. I'm not able to receive communion. It's not an open communion. So it's not an opening and affirming communion that is offered to everyone. And in all honesty, those are the kind of issues that would cause me not to be a part of that particular fellowship. So I fully understand why a person who is in a monogamous gay marriage, who has who have great passion for Christ and love for Christ and are devoted to one another, why they might feel uncomfortable in a setting where they would sit there in a worship service where the people that they're worshiping with do not believe that their union is blessed by God or a sacred marriage in the same way that the heterosexual marriages are. I think I've tried to put myself in those shoes enough to understand where that is. But in a crazy way, it saddens me that issues of sexual orientation or gay marriage have become the only defining issues that we might actually disfellowship people over. How is it that these things rose to this level, and we left everything else behind in the dust and don't talk about that. I do think the Church of the Nazarene, in terms of its theological understanding, has got to work on what baptism means and what membership means. And it may well be that we've got the two backwards, and that we're kind of treating membership like it is what says to you, we affirm that you are a Christian and that you are now a part of us. And I think baptism kind of says that. And that membership is more didache. It is the teaching of the church and the understandings of the church regarding many different ethical issues that are there. And that baptism is an early and quick entrance and acceptance into the fellowship and body of Christ. And all of our brothers and sisters are those who are baptized in Christ. And then didache is when specific congregations, out of their family tree and their biblical understandings, they begin to teach particular positions that are there, and that will distinguish different movements that are out there. So you're asking specifically, what does the Church of the Nazarene do? I think we very quickly try to get to the point of what is baptism and what is membership, and then we try to find our way to how is it that we more graciously explain what we are, and how do we level the field. I mean, I'm ready, if you really want to go whole hog on this, I'm ready to do it with tithing. Let's just, you don't believe in tithing, then your wallet that sits here in our worship service must not be as blessed or sacred as the rest of ours. I mean, we don't do that with all this other stuff that we say we believe deeply. Why is it that we do that with this? It's almost what Justine was saying in the depoliticization of this and our ability to interface with humans. I think as the Trinity was the primary theological doctrine that was studied over the past probably 25 years or so, I think anthropology will be the next new primary theological category. What does it mean to be human is going to be a question that theologians begin to ask and try to answer. And rather than putting our templates on top of people, we will once again learn to listen to people. One last little thing, I learned this from old Doc Moordock. Doc Moordock was the head of our physician's assistant program at Trevecca for a long time. Crusty old guy, died with brain tumor not too long ago, but deeply loved. But people across the medical industry say he turned out the best physician's assistants of any program that they knew. And there was a very simple reason to that. He would train the students in his classes, if you will listen to the patient who comes to you long enough, they will tell you what you most need to know about them. But when you become that God doctor that, the minute they walk in, you start prescribing and analyzing, and here's the medicine, and here's all this stuff, you will never find out what they can tell you that you most need to know to be close enough to them to actually be helpful in their life. I find that to be a mode that I wish Christianity could get into.
Thank you very much. We could do this all night. I could have this conversation until midnight quite happily. I'd need some more coffee, but that's pretty much true of my life in general. However, the time we have is limited, and we want to give each of the panelists an opportunity to make something of a closing statement. What I would like to wrap up into that is if you have particular resources that you would like to point people to, books, podcasts, articles, etc. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the time to get out your note-taking device. And I want to give each of you, we'll start with Dr. Reiner and work this way. If there's a final point or a closing point you'd like to make, but also particularly if there are resources that you would like to point us to so these folks could explore some of these things more on their own. Take us in that direction.
Resources in my area are incredibly limited. That's an understatement. Unfortunately, you'd have to have professional library membership, and that would be tough. There are some resources minimal resources in the intersex world, and you could actually look at the OUHSC, the University of Oklahoma Health Sciences Center. If you look under their website and look under Pediatric Endocrinology, ENDO, endocrinology, they have a little booklet that they put on there that's a very good explanation of intersex. That's a small area. Let me just finish with a little bit of science, and let me just throw two experiments at you to kind of give you an idea of what we do know. Not that scientists necessarily accept these, but let's say you took 100 genetic, we're speaking about the X and the Y a moment ago, the XX and XY. Let's say you take 100 fetuses, embryos who are XY, that is technically they are male, and if you raise them, they all develop to birth, but at birth you cut off their penis and leave everything else the same. And you realize, or the parents realize, oh my goodness, my son doesn't have a penis, and the teaching is, well, let's convert them to female, because if you surgically and hormonally convert them to female, they'll have a happy life. And you do that to 100 genetic male boys who had a normal gonads, normal hormonal exposure. What happens to those 100 boys converted to females at birth, given estrogens at puberty and so on, and they're raised as females? What happens to them in adult life? And then you can do the reverse and say, let's take 100 embryos that are female, XX, and have ovaries and uterus and so on, and let's expose them to male hormone, small amounts, moderate amounts, or amounts even greater than what a typical boy would be exposed to in utero. And let's let those kids develop, and they're born, and let's see what happens to them. We'll fix all of them at birth. We'll take away the male hormone, and everything else will be normal, right? Well, what happens in a very simplistic way, let me just explain that a substantial percentage of the boys raised as girls because they had no penis, who were surgically made into girls, castrated usually in the first few months of life, what happens is that a substantial percentage, approximately 60% when I finished my last study, spontaneously switched to male. It may be at age 3, it may be at age 7. The oldest I have is not really my patient, but someone who I'll include, is 32. Their sexual orientation, roughly about 96% of the ones who admit are attracted to females, and about 2 or 3% are attracted to males. And the truth is that half of those people who didn't switch to male, all of the people who didn't switch to male won't discuss their sexual orientation. But the point is, you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. Is that how it goes? I'm not very good at those things. With the females who are exposed, if you just take the females who are exposed to large doses of male hormone in utero, even more than what a typical male is exposed to, and at birth you make sure all their hormones are fine. After that, they're raised as females, they're surgically fixed, because guess what happens? They have development of their external genitalia that look a little bit like males, a lot like males, or even like a normal male occasionally. And you would say, well, gee, if they're exposed to all that male hormone, big amounts in utero, they'll probably have a high percentage of homosexuality. They'll probably have a high percentage of gender dysphoria. It turns out that homosexuality is much higher in that group of girls than in the typical general population, but not exclusive homosexuality. That is, they are not all homosexual by any means. And in terms of gender dysphoria, about 10% end up having gender dysphoria. Sometimes they transition, sometimes they don't. I know of one who transitioned and then transitioned back again. So you can see, and by the way, the reason I bring this up is because science taught us, or so-called scientists taught us, that you could take a newborn male without a penis. The other side of the coin might be that if you give male hormone to a fetus in utero, that they're all going to develop with a male brain. It turns out that's not true either. So it gets back to the fact that these are incredibly complex scientifically, parts of which can't even be answered, but it isn't the X and the Y that determine these things. Does that make sense? So we can't look at simplistic answers to these questions because they're too complicated.
Thank you very much. Dr. Pitt, closing statement and especially resources. Where would you point folks who want to learn more about these things?
So I am going to focus a little bit on resources here because I think people need resources for sure. Being in a clinic where I work with children and parents, I get to give a lot of resources out to help people as they navigate this process. So there's a couple of things that I'm particularly fond of. For adolescents, I often give parents a book called The Transgender Adolescent, or My Transgender Teen. It's a great book. It really goes through the process of what the experience is like for adolescents that are going through it and helping parents understand it from a very basic level. It's written for parents. It's also written for practitioners, for people that are helping teens. So it's a great book and resource for families to take that journey with their adolescent through that. There's another book I use to help people as well. It's, the author's name is Sarah Cunningham. It's How Do We Sleep at Night? It's a mother's memoir. And I'm not going to steal her thunder by any stretch, but she shares her experience as a parent whose child came out to them in and she was in a very religious environment. So very helpful, I think, for parents. And also, of course, the Academy of Pediatrics has a lot of information for parents in there about talking to their kids about sexuality, being understanding about sexuality and gender identity, and how to address these things that we really don't talk about, that families are afraid to talk about. And the American Psychological Association also has a lot of resources available as well. And just in closing, I really like what Dr. Boone had to say about it's time for us to listen to people. My kids that are coming through are hurting. We have to help.
Amen.
Justine, resources, closing statement, all the above.
A resource that I wish that I had growing up is Interact with a capital ACT. It's a website. I think the address is interactadvocates.org. You might just need to Google it because my memory isn't what it used to be. But it's a resource for, well, if you're interested in learning about intersex issues, it's a resource for everyone, even you hermaphrodites out there who are dyadic. But for those of you who think that you may have an intersex condition or a disorder of sexual development, especially young people who are trying to grow into that and want to know how much information do I actually need to give my healthcare provider, because sometimes I'm uncomfortable, being a novelty to my healthcare provider. These are really good resources that they provide. Another is the Intersex Society of North America, the ISNA. They have variously been very active and not as active throughout the ages, and their primary focus is really kind of advocating right now against surgeries on infants and newborns, because those are really unnecessary and they don't do a lot of good in the long run. But they also provide a lot of resources themselves that you can read through. For those of you who might be dealing with gender identity disorder, I find that a forum called Susan's Place is very helpful. There's a lot of good resources there for what's in my area, what are good endocrinologists. Those are doctors who prescribe hormones and help you with hormone replacement therapy, whether you're intersex or transgender or transsexual. HRT may be something that you're seeking, hormone replacement therapy. Some endocrinologists will do that and some won't, so you might be looking for one in your area, and this forum will lead you to someone who says, I went through this person and they were very helpful, don't go to this place. So Susan's Place is a very good forum to check out as well. I know we barely touched on asexual people. We always forget about them. They're the loneliest letter in the gay alphabet soup of the LGBTIQA, et cetera, et cetera. But there is a good documentary that I recommend that all of you watch called Asexual. It's either with a hyphen or the A is in quotes, but it's on Netflix. So if you have Netflix, I recommend that you watch it. As Christians, I recommend that you watch it and ask yourself how the church can really rally around single people in our midst, whether they are someone who is in the closet or someone who has chosen celibacy or someone who isn't attracted to either sex and may or may not want to have a lifelong partner. So those are some resources that I would recommend. And my closing statement is, in the words of Moana's grandmother, once you know what you like, well, there you are.
Thank you very much. Justine, I know at the end of something like this, people who are introverted like us would often way rather get emails tomorrow than answer questions for the next 2 hours in person. So maybe providing contact information is part of this move. But what resources would you like to point people to? Are there any closing remarks you'd like to make? How can folks get a hold of you in the future?
Yes. Oh my gosh. So you're catching me at a weird place because I spent 16 years with one organization, and now I'm just starting with a new organization. And so I've spent 16 years building and collecting a whole bunch of resources that when I left my previous organization, they're going through changes and it all disappeared from the web. So I am in the process of rebuilding an archive of cool resources on a lot of this subject matter that's not quite up yet, but it's about to be on my website, my lifestyle, I don't know how much of a gay lifestyle I have, but I definitely have a geek lifestyle. My life revolves, in addition to God, of course, my life revolves way too much around pop culture and board games. So my personal website is geekyjustine.com. That's really my website. So if you go to geekyjustine.com, there's a place where you can sign up for
So that's
updates.
geeky, Geeeky.
Geeky, because I'm a geek, Justine, Justin. I'm not Justine.com. And
Good luck plugging an umlaut into Google. It does all sorts of interesting things.
Geekyjustine.com, in case you didn't catch that. If you sign up on I've got a little sign up for information thing. I will send you out an email as soon as I've got more resources available. There's also a contact form on that website, so you can send me a message if there are resources you would really like to see up there. So there's that. I do have a book, as was mentioned. It is called Torn, Rescuing the Gospel from the Gays versus Christians Debate, which tells more of my story and has some of my advice for the church and for folks in the midst of this, and some of the science as well. And I have another book that's coming out in August that you can pre-order. Authors love it when you pre-order their books because it makes booksellers order more of their books in advance. And that book is called Talking Across the Divide. Let me just say as a final note, the world is watching how we as a church, as a body of Christ, handle the issues that we disagree on. We didn't really spend any time up here talking, or very, very little, talking about the theology of marriage, which is a big question, I'm sure, for a lot of you and for us up here. These are important conversations for us to have. And the world has these kinds of conversations where there are disagreements by just trying to gain power and bulldoze over each other. And my hope is that we, as the body of Christ, won't handle our disagreements that way. Because it really hurts our witness to the rest of the world when we do that, as well as other things. So let's have this conversation. Let's work to make sure that we get it right, and we may not all agree on what right looks like, but let's do it with love and grace so that people will know that we are Christians by our love.
Amen. Dr. Boone, resources you'd like to point people to? Closing statement? Take us home.
Sorry, I didn't hear you. The resources I would mention would be, it's a wonderful book. The title of it is Torn by Justine Lee. It's a great book. I actually would strongly recommend that you use that within your local church. I think it'd be a great discussion book to be able to help people see the issue from a different side from which many of them do. And that book's good. Wesley Hill wrote a very similar book called Washed and Waiting that I think accomplishes the same thing. Mark Yarhouse has been helpful to me in understanding a lot of the issues regarding gender dysphoria. His book, Homosexuality and Christianity, and his understanding gender dysphoria, those were two that were helpful. Christopher West, who's kind of a Pope John Paul II for dummies. He interprets Pope John Paul's work on theology of the body in a way that lay people can understand it. But his little book called Fill These Hearts is a great book on sanctity of marriage and relationship. And then I think my favorite one, which really isn't on this topic, but it is a book by Jamie Smith called You Are What You Love. And he talks about the human being as a desiring being versus a compository of knowledge. And it is one of the best spiritual formation books that I know. And it really helped. I think it's a great anthropology book about what does it mean to be human. Last thing I think I'd say would be we're on the Lenten journey right now. And we travel with Christ in this Lenten journey every year on the way to the cross. If the cross says anything to me, it's that the flesh and blood Son of God crawled into every pit in which human beings die and have their lives taken away from them. And there are no humans in any situations that the flesh and blood Jesus has not gone into that pit, and his footprints can be found there. And for us to locate any peoples anywhere in the world as people that cannot find Jesus in the same pit that they're in is to do a disservice to the good news of the gospel and to keep them away from the only grace that truly saves any of us. So on this Lenten journey, may we know that whatever pits we find ourselves in, the footprints of Jesus have been there ahead of us.
Amen. Ladies and gentlemen, that's your panel on human sexuality, science, and faith.